All right, welcome in everybody. Thank you. I am so glad to have Christine Pauley for a book talk this afternoon. Christine is a professor emerita of the School of Library and Information Studies, now the Information School at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she's also director emerita of the Center for the History of Print and Digital Culture, the group that's sponsoring this event today. The Center for the History of Print and Digital Culture studies and promotes scholarship at the intersection of people, print culture, and digital culture, all within the realm of text technologies. You can find out more about the different things that we do and offer on our website or by contacting me through email, Twitter, wherever you like. It is a really great day to be hosting Christine here in Madison via Zoom. We are here to also celebrate and learn more about her most recent book, Organizing Women, Home, Work, in the Institutional Infrastructure of Print in 20th Century America. If you don't already know Christine's work, I hope that you will after this go out and get this book, but also maybe to dive a little bit deeper. One of Christine's great contributions to the scholarship in library study, also in print culture studies, has to do with a really important theoretical move that she made in an article focusing on what she called the middle layer. Christine noticed that in history and print culture studies, there's a lot of focus on individual agency and institutional structures, and insufficient attention to what could be gained by paying attention to where individual people and institutions, large social forces, structures, et cetera, interact, and that's at the institutional level, like at the level of the library. In her book in this most recent book, this continues, she writes, institutionalized infrastructure of print operated at the meso level, this middle layer, an intermediate space between the individual, the micro, and the macro, the societal. The meso is a level that print culture historians, often focusing on questions of individual agency on the one hand and broad historical trends on the other, have often overlooked as a source of information and the site of analysis about reading and writing. If you're not familiar with this article of Christine's about the middle layer, I highly recommend it. It's a really important theory move in print culture studies and in historiography. And for those of us who care about institutions like particular publishing houses or particular libraries, it's a really key accelerant in our thinking. And I really look forward to hearing Christine talk more about that layer where women were doing what she calls the institutional infrastructural work of print. So please join me in welcoming Christine Pauley.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for organizing this event, and thank you to everyone who's joining us. I'm thrilled to be able to talk about my new book from the comfort of my own living room here on the west of Canada, right by the ocean. If we have time at the end, I'll show you the view, but we need to press on at this point. I'm also thrilled to be talking about this book on today, International Women's Day. It seems a very appropriate day to be talking about celebrating women's social, economic, cultural contributions, political contributions as well. So here's my plan for the next half hour or so. First of all, I'm going to leap right in and talk about the main takeaway point of the book, which Jonathan has so nicely set up for us already. And then I'll say a little bit about each chapter. I have some photos I can share, which actually most of them are not in the book. And then if there's time, I can talk a bit about how it all came together, about the writing of the book and about the sources, but we'll see how the time goes, and we'll have time for discussion and any questions later. And because of the kind of awkwardness of the Zoom setup, I think it's best to hold questions until the end. It's just interaction's just too difficult. So if that's okay. So first of all, the pith and moment, if you like, I would say is in the late 19th and the 20th centuries, the great majority of American women experienced the world and left their mark upon the world through the medium of institutions. And by that, I mean through sites of organized, formalized collaboration. And sometimes these experiences were empowering, and sometimes they were hostile. And sometimes women turned institutions against other women. But although women certainly battled institutions, sometimes were even crushed by institutions, they also were able to reshape the institutions so that the institutions became channels for their own agency and, importantly, for other women's agency in the public sphere. So that's the kind of the main takeaway point. There are 6 substantive chapters as an introduction and a conclusion. And the 6 chapters are all about middle-class women living in mostly the first part of the 20th century. They were not famous or celebrated particularly, but they were notable in their own sphere, in their own fields, in their own localities. Notable for gaining a voice and scope for action in public life, and particularly in print culture. They were all relatively comfortably off, not affluent, but not poor either. They were also relatively well educated. Most had been to college. But in other ways, their lives differed. Some were married with children and some were not. Some were Black, some were white, some were rural, some were urban. But what they all shared was an attachment to reading and writing and a deep involvement in organizations of print. And by organizations of print, I mean organizations that focus their main activities on reading and writing and print technology. And so these included commercial printing and publishing houses, bookstores, newspapers, but they also included non-profit organizations, educational organizations, government organizations like schools and colleges and libraries, the USDA extension system, and I talk about the YWCA. So we commonly think about women such as these as pioneers, and in fact the blurb in the book refers to them as pioneers. And indeed, in the history of print culture, women often do materialize as individual authors or readers working against entrenched, excuse me, sorry about that, striving against large-scale social forces. Perhaps they appear as influential leaders fighting for suffrage or against lynching, for example. But I'm arguing that these narratives of personal activism, struggling against these social structures, these narratives are misleading if they ignore the role of organizations and bureaucracy. Now, bureaucracy has become a dirty word. It's synonymous really with pointless routine, rules, standardization, rigidity, hierarchy. Talcott Parsons, who's the famous himself translator of Max Weber, the even more famous sociologist of bureaucracy, Talcott Parsons translated Weber's notion of bureaucracy as an iron cage. But for the organizing women in the book, they're far from trapping them in impersonal, repetitive, powerless systems. Institutional involvement gave meaning to their lives, even, I could say, threw them a lifeline. The women's organizational identities opened up all kinds of possibilities for them, for both individual and group action, and influence, and self-fulfillment also. And this involvement was not an accident, it was a strategy. So most of the book is about these organizational strategies that these uncelebrated middle-class women used to move beyond the unpaid private domestic sphere to which most middle-class women were restricted in the 19th century, in ways that enabled them to act and be heard in the economic and political and cultural worlds beyond their homes, beyond their domestic roles. Though each chapter hangs on the actions of one or more individuals, but also tells the story of the organizations that provided the framework for their actions. The stories relate how the women negotiated the terms on which they engaged with the world outside their homes, and did so in ways that opened up possibilities for large numbers of women following. And the possibilities were not unlimited, but even with constraints, the print-centered organizations were particularly hospitable to women. Actually, they needed the women as workers also, but they gave women increased control of such resources, money, time, space, and they gave them settings in which they could make their voices heard, an entry into the world of politics and power. They gave them networking and collaborative contacts, and they gave them geographical mobility. The organizations provided kind of blueprints for the women's action and control of resources, and scaffolding for their networking and travel. And because they were print-centered, they gave legitimacy and almost camouflage to the women's radical actions, because it was seen as natural that women should work in print culture organization. So as Jonathan mentioned, the book is underpinned by a theoretical view, if you like, from the middle, focuses on organizations as sites where individuals, the micro, encounter the macro structuring forces of wider society. Now let's talk for a minute about the word in the title, infrastructure. It's a word that's become much used over the last decade or so. And so what is the infrastructure of print? In the late 19th and 20th centuries, print-centered organizations were part of this often unnoticed infrastructure that supported and shaped ordinary Americans' reading and writing. It had tangible physical features, which included buildings, schools, libraries, bookstores, and machines for printing, binding, distributing, furniture, bookshelves, magazine racks, even library stools, and as well as the books, the tangible books and newspapers and magazines and pamphlets themselves. And less tangible were legal components, such as copyright laws and legislation that enabled and also regulated public schools and libraries and universities, and epistemological components like cataloging, classification systems, and paratextual conventions, and then professional components that shaped the actions of the workforce. These tangible and intangible infrastructural aspects allowed organizations to act in ways that were standardized and reliable and widely available. The book also focuses on a complex relationship between Blackness and whiteness and print culture. For example, on the ways in which the infrastructure of print systematically suppressed Black print culture. In public libraries, Black authors and titles were ignored by collecting aids and practices, as well as by review mechanisms of mainstream press. And topics of interest, programs, facilities for Black readers were also ignored or blocked by segregation and neglect. So there's some advantages of studying organizations as well as individuals. First of all, you get a kind of continuity beyond the lifespan of individuals. And through this continuity, historians can see flows of constraint and resistance and innovation over time. And then they give you access to organizational genres of writing, bibliographies, lists, annual and other reports, and official correspondence, which can be a rich source of information, particularly about women as public actors. Focusing on organizational texts brings into view the powerful ways in which institutions and their documents continue to shape the lives of pretty much all Americans in the 20th and early 21st century. And let us see how their organizations are purposefully designed, authored, if you like, by individuals and groups with goals and agendas. So that's a broad outline of the book's main takeaways. So now I'm going to describe it briefly on the assumption that few people have actually seen the book. The first 3 chapters are about women who were based at home. They were mostly married with children. And then the second 3 chapters about women who worked full-time out of the home. They were not married, they were childless. And I'll tell you a little bit about each of the chapters. And I also have some pictures, which I'm going to screen share at the same time, if I can make that work. hold on. Let's see. No, not that one. This one. No, wrong. Now, how's that? No, wait, that. How is that working?
Yep, you're up.
Okay, so I'll just put my email address there on that first slide in case anybody wants to get in touch with you directly if we don't have time to get to your question or your comment or whatever. But, okay, so chapter 1, there's the title, is about Clara Stein Scott. I just want to shrink something on my own. How do I do that? Well, I can manage. Sorry, I'm clicking in all the wrong places. So on the right, there you see Clara herself, looking very serious and academic. And the main picture is of Agricultural Hall at Iowa State College. So Clara Stein Scott was born on an Iowa farm in 1888. She was the 5th of 8 children. She lived until 1994, until 1994, when she was 107. And she died in Middleton, Wisconsin, so ended her life living very close to Madison. And in 1908, she entered Iowa State College as a freshman in journalism and home economics. And this choice of these 2 subjects shaped the rest of her life. She lived first on her parents' farm, and then after she married Hans Scott, who was a farm owner, an agronomist, they lived on their own family farm. They had 4 children. And then they lived in various places where Hans was a government advisor. He worked in Washington, D.C. in the 30s and in Manchuria, China in the 1940s. But all through her life, wherever she found herself, Clara wrote for publication in the farm press and county newspapers. She was drawing on her scientific and technical education to explain to her imagined female rural audience how the skills and knowledge of home economics could make their domestic work easier and more effective. I had to share this picture of Iowa State University because I love the sheep in the front there. There they are, kind of cropping the grass, which is how that happened before the advent of lots of oil and lawnmowers, tractors, and so on. So anyway, she was very much a product of the progressive area she grew up in. And she was really thoroughly enmeshed in a variety of print-centered organizations that included this land-grant college, the USDA Extension Service, the agricultural and local press, public libraries, and all kinds of local writers groups. But another side of Clara's reading and writing experience leaves us feeling more ambivalent. And like millions of other Americans of her day, she read bestsellers by such writers as Morris Thompson and James Fox Jr., who you may well never have heard of. But these novels, read by millions of others, infused her daily life with an endemic, unexamined racism. They told stories about a mythical past in which white American men triumphed on the field of battle and won the love and devotion of white American women. People of color invariably appeared as foils to these white heroes, and always as either servile or comic or even evil. Sorry, I should have told you that this slide shows a picture of the kinds of magazines that Clara Stein wrote in. But here are examples of the books she was reading. So Jean Stratton Porter was another favorite of hers and of millions of others. And Stratton Porter depicted this contemporary world ideally populated by white farm families like Clara Stein's own farm families, leading honest, hardworking lives in healthy pastoral surroundings that Stratton Porter contrasted with the crime-ridden, overcrowding, immigrant-infested industrialized cities. It was a very common kind of trope of the time. So these were very popular novels. They were delivered to Clara by a racially exclusive institutional infrastructure of print, which naturalized and reinforced this gendered and racial ordering of the country and continued to underpin significant power relationships for most of the 20th century. This reading for pleasure encouraged Clara, a white woman of Northern European descent, to accept the channeling as normal and natural. And it also contrasted with the modernizing thrust of her writing and with the image she presented herself as sturdy, competent, and independent. So she had this kind of bifurcated relationship with print, scientific and modernizing on the one side, and romantic, racist on the other side, on the other hand. So at the same time that Clara Steen was promoting scientific modernism on the family farm in the small Iowa town of Shenandoah in the 1930s, Leanna Driftmeyer was a mother of 7 and a wheelchair user following an accident, created a daily radio show and magazine that she and her family broadcast the radio show from her own kitchen, targeting mostly white married women like herself. She was a radio homemaker. And like other radio homemakers, she produced a magazine, to a newsletter, which kind of went with the show. And at its height reached 90,000 readers. So here in the slide, you see the young Leanna on the right, and then she became this very venerable, elderly sort of patron of this program for years. She lasted into the 1960s, I think. The show lasted into the 1980s. And so there on the left, you see pictures of Kitchen Clatter magazine, which changed very little over the decades that it was in existence. So that chapter 2 describes how Kitchen Clatter show and magazine became its kind of regional institution. And for 60 years, the family communicated with listeners and readers in Iowa and up to 6 surrounding states. And in both the radio and the publishing operation, Driftmeyer stressed her personal relationship with her assumed white readers. So she assumed they were like herself. She encouraged them to write back to her, and by publishing a selection of their letters, she created this forum for readers to share their ideas and their problems and their successes. And she also urged the readers to write on their own account. So she encouraged them to write memoirs and cookbooks. She stressed their personal agency and the importance of interactivity. So she kind of blended reading, writing. Every reader could be a writer, she said, or thought. For the Driftmeyers, Leanna's radio homemaking was an enterprise that eventually encompassed the entire family, constituted their main activity and source of income. So that the kids would come home from school and their mothers on the radio talking from the kitchen, and they'd join in and help. By co-opting the household in this way, Leanna overcame the tension that other women experienced between their family and work needs. Even then, it couldn't have been easy. I mean, they appear never anything less than, everything seems to be just totally rosy with the Driftmeyers in Leanna's presentation of them, but it can't have always been that easy. But she was encouraging the readers and listeners to see themselves and to have a happy American family just like her own. She was not the only one doing this at the time. Radio homemakers were quite a feature of life in the 1930s, 1940s, and 50s. And here are a couple of pictures of others. Jessie Young was one of the first radio homemakers. Here she is broadcasting from her kitchen, and one of the first to have a magazine that went along with the show. And then Evelyn Birkby, who worked for Kitchen Clatter, but she eventually became a kind of historian for the radio homemakers. And she became, nationally famous. She appeared on some national breakfast television show in the 1990s. So what more fame than that? So, it's not moving along. Oh, there we go. So at the same time that Clara Steen and Leanna Driftmeyer were appealing to this rural audience of white homemakers that they imagined to be like themselves, a group of 10 African-American women living in Des Moines, Iowa, had a very different agenda. Despite their self-description as home women, this group showed very little interest in reading about domestic subjects that preoccupied the farm-pressed columnists or the radio homemakers. And for them, perhaps domesticity had these bitter connotations, since housework was often paid housework, was often the only kind of employment that even educated American women could get during Jim Crow years. So instead, told in chapter 3, in the mid-1920s, they started a reading club, which they operated out of the segregated branch of the Des Moines YWCA. So the YWCA was segregated until 1947. So their purpose was to review new books. And so surviving programs, like the picture of one you have here, indicate they showed lots of interest in reading books by Black writers and books that discuss topics of political and social concern. Another picture of them, they call themselves the book lovers. So there's the book lovers in about the 1950s. So chapter 3 talks mostly a lot about their choice of titles and authors, and shows how poorly they would have been served by the public libraries that relied on standard collecting guides of the day. Actually, the Public Library of Des Moines, under Forrest Spaulding, he of the Library Bill of Rights, those of you who have heard of him, was actually in the forefront of trying to diversify public library collections to include more works by Black writers. Then the 3 chapters in the second half focus on women who turned their backs on marriage and instead located their life's work within various aspects of the developing public library system, which I say is perhaps the most successful and long-lasting of the 20th century's non-profit, print-centered organizations. Now, chapter 4 is about Lutie Eugenia Stearns, a terror and a legend. She was a woman who rejoiced in her own spinsterhood. She wrote a bibliography called Books of Interest and Consolation to Spinsters, published in 1904. And she was a key player in setting up the Wisconsin Free Library Commission. From its founding in 1895 and over the next 70 years, excuse me, the commission developed into one of the strongest state library agencies in the country. Programs took root and endured for decades and provided impetus for similar efforts in other states. Stearns and her colleagues developed a system of traveling libraries. You see the pamphlet on the left there. These were collections of books in several languages that the commission deposited in rural post offices or stores or farmhouses, wherever they could find somebody who would take the library and make it publicly available. And they reached hundreds of readers in remote areas. She also helped establish county systems of traveling libraries and municipal public libraries. But despite this demonstration of organizational drive and skill and having the ideas and energy behind the commission's very existence, she could never aspire to head the agency or really impose her vision for the agency. So for the next 50 years, the powerful position of commission secretary, which is the CEO really of the agency, was occupied by a succession of men. And here she is in the 1930s, I would say, with a couple of sayings that she recorded in the 1940s. She gave interviews, autobiographical interviews, as in her, she was in her 1970s, she was in her 70s by this time. But I think they're kind of remarkable to say in 1940 that the word obey in marriage ritual was inserted by the men framers of the right as a survival of the old time regard of women as sexual vassals to men. The right of every woman to her own body should be sacred. Well, gosh, 70 years ago, that pretty amazing. And then I've been called a radical and a communist, but I recall that Susan B. Anthony was termed an old hen and Jane Addams was designated as the most dangerous person in America. So I'm in good company. So she had these sort of pithy sayings, but she was also kind of terrifying, I think. She was a library visitor in the state, and I think I have evidence that the librarians were a little nervous when she showed up to have a look and see how their work was going. Another project for the Wisconsin Free Library Commission was the Wisconsin Library School, so the precursor for the information school. And in chapter 5, we see how from the school's opening in 1906 until she retired in 1938, Mary Imogen Hazeltine, here she is, looking very different from Lootie Stearns, I'm sure you'll agree. She was born in New York State, and she was a Wellesley College graduate. How she ran the school at a time when most library workers had no formal training at all. So she did everything. She managed the intake of the white, mostly female aspiring librarians. She supervised the faculty, oversaw the budget, taught classes, counseled thousands of students, and she was the public face of the institution. And she was a passionate advocate for libraries, devised the book-centered curriculum, transmitted her philosophy of reading to hundreds of students who fanned out as missionaries of the book. And drawing on a domestic trope, she saw the school as her family and treated the student body as her girls. Her job included finding them employment, not only immediately after they graduated, but also as they progressed in their careers. She created a dense network of contacts, which she maintained almost entirely through written correspondence. So she had a really detailed knowledge of employment conditions all over the country and of individual personalities. Here's a picture of the students on an outing in Devil's Lake in 1926. But I just love to see how relaxed and enjoying each other's company they are. And I'm pretty sure that black box thing in the middle there is a gramophone. So they were relaxing to music, I imagine. Yeah. So Hazeltine also wrote and edited extensively in the expanding professional literature, and she encouraged her students to do the same. But again, like Lootie Stearns, despite her pivotal role, her official title was preceptor, because technically the principal was the male commission secretary. And when Hazeltine retired in 1938, never having achieved professor status, she was replaced by a male director with a faculty appointment. And finally, in the last chapter, oh no, there's a picture of Mary Imogen at her desk. And actually, I think that desk may still be around, you know, without the little pull-out things. Some of that furniture was still rolling around in Sliss 10 years ago when I retired, so it could still be there, who knows. So that's the last substantive chapter. Shows how in the middle of the 20th century, some of the institutional barriers of race built into the public library system were giving way to determined efforts to expand the infrastructure of print to support African-American efforts to get access information about their history and culture. In the early part of the 20th century, the Chicago Public Library was spending a lot of effort expanding its branch libraries, mostly in white immigrant neighborhoods. And in 1931, Vivian Gordon Harsh, who was the first African-American to run a CPL branch library, was appointed head of a brand new branch on Chicago's predominantly African-American South Side. Here you see a picture of the George Cleveland Hall branch at the time of its opening. Harsh was a member of Chicago's old settler Black elite. She was very involved in local history groups. She set out to build what she called a special Negro collection that she hoped would provide the basis for a serious and sustained study of African-American history and culture. Her branch library quickly turned into a neighborhood center where children and adults learned about Black history and discovered books in which they could see people like themselves in a positive light, unlike in the books that Clara Steen was reading. And there too, the Chicago Black Renaissance writers like Richard Wright and Gwendolyn Brooks, as well as nationally known figures like W.E.B. Du Bois and Langston Hughes, came to gather materials and discuss ideas and deliver lectures. This is a picture of the opening day of the George Cleveland Hall branch, and there is Vivian Harsh in the middle, dead center there. I love this picture. It's just so evocative of the excitement of the day. You see flowers and people dressed up, and apparently it was a wonderful occasion. But Harsh's appointment and her plans for this collection aroused controversy, as you can imagine, within the CPL, when the library board chairman questioned her credentials. You know, she qualified to be a manager of these, some of them white assistants. And then he raised the specter of her collection causing a race riot. But Carl Roden, who was the CPL's chief librarian at the time, he defended her, lent support behind the scenes. He didn't expose himself politically, but he turned to Chicago's civil service employment rules to justify his decisions and to protect Harsh. So he illustrated these actions illustrated how institutional structure, which in many ways restricted and confined a Black person like Harsh, could also provide opportunities and cover for more radical action. By all accounts, Harsh was a private person. She was always very appropriately dressed and very professional, restrained manner. The staff called her the lieutenant. After her death, the Chicago Defender wrote a page-long eulogy, and the title was "The Historian Who Never Wrote." She was, the eulogist wrote, an innovator who brought life and purpose to the Hall Branch and to the Negro community it served, a brilliant historian, and an enigma to friend and foe alike. But the title was misleading, because Harsh may not have herself been a published historian, but she left a written record of her work in the form of very carefully written annual reports and many published notices and articles about Hall Branch activity. And her presence can also be found in the paratexts of innumerable works of history produced by other authors. Gendered assumptions about the intellectual contribution of librarians in collecting and describing and enumerating has rendered virtually visible to scholars the catalogues and indexes and bibliographies and clippings files they created. But as Laura Helton argues in an excellent article in the book by Jonathan Senshin and Bridget Fielder, Helton argues, in recording and enumerating a tradition, Harsh and other groundbreaking Black librarians were the system builders of Black thought. Most of the major characters in the book were notable in their own times, only in their own localities and professional circles, but the exception is Vivian Harsh, whose life's work, the creation of the Special Negro Collection after setbacks in the 1950s, grew in strength and recognition in a new home and with a new title. Named after this obscure female branch librarian rather than celebrated male donors like the Schomburg collection, named after Arturo Schomburg, or the Moreland Spingarn collection at Howard University. The Vivian G. Harsh Research Collection memorializes not only Harsh's vision, but also her intellectual ability, her unceasing hard work, and for most, the invisibility of their work rendered, for most organizing women, the invisibility of their work rendered them invisible as workers. But the exception to this invisibility in this book, that it should be provided by a Black woman who was so personally, noticeably reticent and reserved, just seems, it gives me pleasure. It seems very fitting that it should have worked out that way. So let me turn off the share. Let me turn as a person here. Now I've talked for like 40 minutes probably. I could say a little bit about writing the book, or we could just go to discussion. It's sort of up to you. If there are questions, why don't we, do you want to go to that? I could.
Sure. We have plenty of time if you want to either add to the discussion about how you wrote the book during Q&A, or if you'd like to continue formal remarks for another couple of minutes, it's totally up to you.
Well, I'll just say just a little tiny bit about writing the book, because it really took me a long time. The book, you know, it's been in the works for about 2 decades. I was thinking, you know, when you write your first book, because it comes out of your dissertation, and it goes pretty quickly because you've already got it in your dissertation, and then the next book takes about 10 years because, you know, you're doing all these other things as well by this time, if you're lucky, and maybe, you know, getting tenure and all that. And then the third book takes even longer because it's been written over a longer period of time. So some of this was written in some of the stuff about Lucy Stearns I first wrote in the late 1990s. So by the time the book comes out, you know, it's nearly a quarter of a century. But actually, it was very satisfying to return to the early work and to kind of rework it and think it out in view of the things that I've been thinking about in the meantime. So for me, the writing of the book seemed very kind of serendipitous and contingent, and I feel very fortunate to have had the time to write it. I mean, I'm glad it's my last book, but at the same time, I enjoyed writing it more than I can say, really, especially that last bit where you pulled everything together and sort of think about how this relates to that. All that part was just very exciting. So that's all I want to say at this point.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking Christine for this talk. One thing I really miss about in-person talks, even though it's lovely to pull people together from all around the country, is the thunderous applause at the end. So
we can imagine.
Insert that or use the emoji as needed. We have plenty of time for celebrating through questions this book, or just celebrating through celebratory statements, whatever people like. I may repeat questions if people's audio comes in low or comes in and out, or I could also read them off the chat. I certainly have questions, but I'd like to open it up to our many visitors to go first. They'd like. You can go ahead and I can't really see from a moderator's perspective, so you can also go ahead and unmute yourself. Kristen Eschenfelder, I can see you. Please take it away.
Hi, Christine. It's so good to see you.
See you too. Maybe make you bigger.
So I have a million things I would love to talk to you about, but I will refrain and focus on your book. So I'm curious, you know, having the perspective of going back to your earlier material and knowing the field as a whole, what do you think the most important steps are in print culture history?
Oh, God.
What do you think needs to be done? Somebody's got to do it.
Well, I'm not sure I can answer the most. Let me tell you about something that sort of impelled me all through, which was the kind of, I talked about invisibility of women's work, but also the invisibility of libraries as institutions worthy of historians' attention, and how, when I first started getting involved in print culture history in the late 1980s, library history was in a kind of ghetto. Only certain kind of publishers would publish works that dealt with library history. Institutional history was seen as a kind of dirty word. Nobody wanted to do institutional history. And library historians themselves were seen as this embattled kind of crew. And I think that it has broken out of that. I think that I'm gratified to see, this was not all me that did this, but you know, that this is something that has happened in the last 30 years, that mainstream historians have suddenly woken up to the role that libraries play, and the fact that libraries are contingent on historical events and didn't just fall from the sky, you know, fully fledged, or to mix the metaphor. So that's been an aspect of print culture history. I think, to tell you, you know, I'm not sure, this may be an apocryphal story, but when the 5-volume history of the book in America was first conceived, I think they were not including libraries at all. Well, the library historians got up, you know, and changed their minds. But I think now that no one would think of doing that. So ironically, since the advent of electronic technology has put into question whether libraries were going to continue to exist, attention to the history of libraries has also asserted itself.
There's a question in the chat from Susie Seefeld Zutra, a former student of mine and yours as well. She writes, and this is maybe some more inside baseball for Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin folks, is where does Helen C. White fit into this range of women that you cover in the book? Helen C. White, a former UW English professor, medievalist, and namesake of the building that our library school occupies, at least for the next few years, dating back to 1967.
I'm a failure. I have no idea.
Okay.
I'll answer that question at all. I could look it up, but probably Susie could look it up herself too and come up with a better answer. So sorry. I think English professor tells you everything, though, you know, so yeah.
Are there other questions? I can't see everybody, so if you're raising a hand, I can't necessarily see it. Jennifer Burrick Pierce.
Hi. Hello, Christine, and thank you so much for this. As I was listening to you, I felt like it was sort of so many names that I've seen in other places, people you've written about, the librarian for whom the archives where one of my students now works being listed there, some people you've written about before. Are there other people that you have stories about that didn't make the highlights, names in the newsreel that you sort of so kindly shared with us?
Well, oh, for sure. There are characters in the book who thread through several chapters that I'm just giving you a little sketch. One was Teresa West Elmendorf, who was the first woman to go to an ALA conference in the 1890s. She was at that point, she was the deputy director of Milwaukee Public Library. And she got on the train, it was 1,000 miles. She got on the train, it was like in New York, upstate New York somewhere she traveled to, Lake Placid or somewhere like that. Through a scandal, she became the director of the Milwaukee. So the director of the Milwaukee Public Library was accused of embezzling funds and had to resign. So they appointed her. If it hadn't been an emergency, she probably never would have become the director. But they had to put somebody in. There she was. So she gets a woman. She becomes the director of the Milwaukee Public Library, and then she falls in love and marries Henry Elmendorf, who was the director of St. Joseph, Missouri Public Library, a city much smaller than Milwaukee. But as a result, she has to resign. There's no question of him resigning and moving to Milwaukee. She resigned and they moved together to Buffalo, upstate New York. Where she continues to work. She writes annotations for standard guides and ALA standard guides, and she becomes the president of ALA even. So she's still working away in the background. But then Henry dies, and they consider, the library board in Buffalo consider making Teresa director, but no, she's what they call the vice librarian, and there she stays. They appoint somebody else over her head, and so she never gets further than being vice librarian for the rest of her life. And so the heights of her ambition, and somebody else I talk about too, were just before they got married, and then marriage exerts this penalty. And just, basically kind of kicks them down the road. So she pops up in several chapters. She's a friend of Mary Imogen Hazeltine's. To one of these. Yeah, it was a small world. The ALA conferences were like, well, the membership was something like 500. in those days. So kind of hard to imagine. Yeah. Thank you. Good question.
Additional questions? Danielle Fuller, raised hand.
Hi, hello, Christine. It's great to see you. We're in sort of the same bit of the same landmass because I'm here in Edmonton on Treaty 6, which is where I live now. So, so thank you so much for that talk. And I love the photographs, by the way, they were fabulous. Really, especially the picnic one with the gramophone. That was really something, wasn't it? So I wondered if working on this book, if there was if you could reflect a bit on how working on this book either complicated your thinking about that meso level and the sort of, and that concept of the kind of middle level, or altered it in any way.
If anything, it strengthened it. I mean, I think I came up with the idea back in about 15 years ago. And let me say, you know, this meso level, I remember reading about that in something written about the new institutionalism by Paul DiMaggio in like 1991. So this is, you know, it's long roots. And also Dorothy E. Smith, reading about Dorothy E. Smith was also, yes, indeed, very influential. Very grateful to Dorothy E. Smith, who just died not that long ago. Yeah. So back to your question. I think that coming to that notion was what really helped me pull all this together. This manuscript started life as a totally different manuscript. The first 3 chapters I had as part of a different book with another ending and with a different 3 chapters at the end. And then I sent it off to Erin Smith, if you know Erin, and various other people who wrote, you know, helpful things, just to say, well, what do you think? And Erin about that, and she said, well, I think you've got 2 books here. You haven't got 1 book, you've got 2. And so I took the second 3 chapters and turned it into a book that came out in 2010. And then the first 3 chapters I put together with these different 3 chapters, and here it is now. So it has had I really recommend a long cooking time. It in a way, it sort of put flesh on the bones. I had this theoretical notion, but I could see how being part of an organization made all the difference to somebody like Vivienne Harsh. For example, she got scholarships to go traveling from the senior moment. Come back to me. Man made his money in Sears. Philanthropist, never mind, doesn't matter. They gave her a scholarship to go traveling, to collect for the Special Negro collection. But she would never have got those scholarships if she didn't have a position as the head of this library. They've never given them to her as an individual. And so it opened doors for her. And similarly with Lutie Stearns, I mean, this position opened doors. She would go and talk to people on municipal boards and county boards of supervisors and things like that. She would never have had that chance. So, yeah. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Great.
Good to see you.
Jacqueline Goldsby also perhaps has the name you're looking for.
Yeah, the Rosenwald Foundation supported Harsh's research trip. This is wonderful, and thank you so much for the book. And I'm glad that I'm on sabbatical and we'll have time to read it from cover to cover. So I really look forward to it. I had a couple of questions about the first half of the book, and actually the structure as you described it was really intriguing to me. And I wanted to just know a little bit more about the radio broadcasting from the Iowa housewife. I'm curious, how did she get access to that technology, and what's the kind of cultural milieu about that? And then secondly, I was very struck that for the Book Lovers Club, the Black Women's Reading Group in Des Moines, that they're in the part of the book that concerns married women, right? So I'm curious to hear more about what what claims are you making, or what insights did you gain about them being married and book lovers? And did their marital status have anything to do with the kinds of ways in which their reading, I could imagine, being wayward, to think of Saidiya Hartman, perhaps?
Okay, so what was the first question again? First
Oh,
question.
about the radio technology.
Radio-
and-
radio
yeah.
technology. So quickly with that. So this is the 1920s when radio technology was just new. And it was mostly being used at this point in the mid 1920s for advertising. And in Southwest Iowa, Shenandoah became known as a kind of radio land because competing seed companies bought radio stations to advertise their seed products to the surrounding farmers. But they had all this daytime hours that they had to fill, and there was no recording technology. So you couldn't just push a button and have something, music come on or something. It had to have a live person. So they started putting members of their families up in front of the microphone. I start the chapter with an excerpt from a novel by Fanny Flagg called Welcome to the World, Baby Girl. And that starts with a neighbor Dorothy, who was a radio homemaker. And so both of these seed companies put their family members up, and Leanna's brother, Henry Field, was one of those. And so when Leanna Driftmeyer she had a radio show where she would go down to the radio station, and the kids were, the whole household was kind of organized around Leanna's getting down to the radio station. But when she had the car accident, and then she became a wheelchair user and could not get down to the radio station, then her brother hardwired her kitchen and put a microphone in there. So that's how the technology worked.
Can I ask follow-up, like why? Okay, so then why did she feel compelled, and who was involved in making the newsletter with her?
She kept getting letters from readers, and it was part of a letter writing to the newspaper culture at the time. People were used to writing to farm papers. They used to have columns and encourage people to write, and so there was this letter writing culture that they just sort of fed into. And she had a letter from Leanna Column herself, so that the newsletter always, it was her way of responding to these letters, and by include the suggestions that came in from the letter writers. So and I tell in the book of sort of heartrending stories, but one in particular, a woman who was abused by her husband, who had to sneak her letters out of the house. And these were letters written to Evelyn Birkby. And she had a code word in the letter that Evelyn was supposed to use on the air. So she knew that Evelyn had received the letters. And this was her link to the outside world. Yeah. And so then the book lovers described themselves as home women. They said, we are a group of home women and we want to get together and read. So and maybe that was a kind of cover for them, but I don't think that they necessarily saw themselves as subversive, although they could well have done, because at that time it would have been seen as subversive had they said, we want to read Black writers and we want to read about political things. So they didn't say any of that. They in the published publicity, the publicity that made it to the outside world, they said, we're interested in education and scientific advance and all that sort of thing. And sure enough, all those things appeared. But this thread of interest in books by Black authors, which were hard to get, and I speculate about how they located them, identified them. They took the crisis and opportunity, both of those magazines, but often they were ahead in their reviewing of particularly of opportunity. So maybe in the churches they heard about what books they could read, because there was not a readily available, there were not book lists out there. There were a few about read this. There's a new book by so and so. So they were kind of at the forefront of that. So what else was part of that question?
Oh, no, that I just wanted to know a little bit more about, since they're in the section of the book that concerns married women, I was wondering what kind of relays were there. But can you give a quick hint about what they were reading? So Crisis and Opportunity, anything else?
Well, because they were reviewing new books. You know, a lot of the books you kind of think, oh, they read books from the Harlem Renaissance, but they've been published too early for this. I really only have the books from the 1930s, 1940s. They read the Let Me Live, Angelo Herndon's Let Me Live. Although I think that was very popular in mainstream press as well. And it could have resonated with the Scottsboro Boys, that were also very much in the mainstream press at the time. I can't recall the.
No, I'll read the book. This is a great thing. Thank you very much.
Definitely.
It's so interesting. I've been working a little bit on a group of Black readers here in Madison who also called themselves the Book Lovers Club, 1909 to 1911. So they're much earlier, but they met here in the small sort of Black enclave around the AME Zion church here in Madison on East Dayton Street, and their minutes are in the Wisconsin Historical Society. And that was one thing that I appreciated reading this book too. And it reminded me also of a way in which like other groups like the Colored Conventions Project are returning to things like minutes in order to excavate these histories and make visible the work of people doing organizing work, of institutional work, of exactly the history that you're showing here. So again, just want to sort of appreciate that and think about the way in which you draw out these institutional documents like minutes as places where we need to be doing this research. And then also just note how interesting there's another Black Book Lovers Club. It wasn't just a women's club. There were women and men, but they were reading the Black press. They did a month on Phillis Wheatley and reading Phillis Wheatley and giving lectures and papers on Phillis Wheatley. That's why I'm kind of working on them at the moment. But it's interesting how that name was traveling in the Midwest for Black readers groups.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating.
Leslie Hausum writes, wonderful to see Christine again. We used to meet at Sharp conferences. Don't have a question, but want to go on record about how significant the institution theme is. Lots to think about for book historians. Agreed.
Thank you, Leslie.
Right.
Okay.
Are there other questions? We're a little bit past the hour. Would be a good time, unless there's another question emergent, to thank Christine again for this wonderful book. It's great to be able to host this virtually from the current iteration of the Wisconsin Library School, to have two directors, Kristen Eschenfelder and Christine Pauli, who literally took the seat of Miss Hazeltine, and also to be sponsoring this talk from an institution that Christine really grew as both a doctoral student in this department and then returning years later as director of the Center for the History of Print and Digital Culture. So we thank you for all that work, for making it possible to inhabit this place, this institution that you took great care of for many years. And congratulations on this new book. You've given us so much to think about. And thank you to all of our attendees as well for carving out some of your afternoon to spend with us.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. This has been lovely. Thank you.
And I'm going to figure out how to stop the recording. There we go.
Right.